Right, let's get back in here. Actually, someone took a photo before of me here and you cannot see me. Tall things, my nemesis. You can see me there though, eh? It's just that way. Apologies. I envied the lady from Woolworths who could see over it. All right, come on, move faster, because that poor person ringing that bell, man. They're going to break an elbow or something. All right. Oh, thanks, everyone. No, it's hard in the afternoon. Right, come on. I think there's drinks or something at some point, so let's just keep that in mind. Is there? Or have I just promised something that's not happening? Yep, there's drinks. Right. We'll just allow people to move in, but we'll just get started, Because I want to keep things to time. Right, so I want to make a quick comment before we move on, and I just want to say, I think when we have something as big as climate to talk about, we have to see success as not always getting a perfect result. And I guess my comment is to the He Waka Eke Noa. I don't necessarily think that was a failure. I think it was a process that gave us lessons. And I think that if we think that the only time we're going to have a success is when something is a win or a fail, then we're actually not going to get very far with any of our climate stuff. And I think if we have good, the good success is He Waka Eke Noa was a vehicle that enabled a conversation. And I think we need to look at it like that. And that will be modelled going forward again. I'm sure we'll call it different things so people think it's different, but I just think we need to be conscious that if we define everything as success in climate, as perfect outcomes, we're really not going to get anywhere fast enough. Right now, we're getting into the finance session. So this is going to be around trade and market drivers for agricultural emissions reduction. Now, it's a little bit scary that, these are older numbers by the way, but in 2022-23, S&P had numbers, or Standard & Poor's had numbers that out of all the sustainable finance, only 5% was spent on adaptation. 95% was spent on mitigation. And I think we're seeing, and we've heard today, that we may have, the horse is bolted, so to speak. And so now we need to make sure that we've got adaptation. So we've got people here today that we're going to talk around finance, and we're going to talk around reporting as well. Behaviour follows capital. So when capital moves in a particular direction, you'll see that behaviour will start to follow it. Been in banking for many years, was in banking for many years, and as capital will shift and its needs shift, you'll find a different behaviour will follow, because none of us are that wealthy that we don't need, or many businesses will need capital. So I'm super excited to call up Dr. Carly Green, Dr. Amelia Sharman. Sharman, sorry, I've got that wrong in the first 30 seconds. How rude. And Aidan Gent. Aidan is the Haitian to my Yan. So I'm going to call Aidan up first, and then we'll please post questions as we're going, and we'll go straight into questions as soon as we can. And if you're
Thanks, JJ. It's always tough following JJ on stage because you're not sure what lunch sounds will be picked up by the microphones when they're pointed at my stomach. There's always a new tall joke I can crack when I'm following Julia on stage. Look, it's great to be here. I'm Aidan Gent, the only non-doctor on the stage. It appears I am a dairy farmer from Ruai in Northland, so potentially that counts for something. But more importantly, I'm here in my capacity as General Manager of Rural Banking at ASB. Here to talk about the finance perspectives on climate and emissions, and I guess three parts I'll cover off and try to do it quickly because I'd like the Q&A to go a little bit longer if we could have that as an option. Why we care about emissions and climate, what we're seeing, and then finally how we're thinking about helping the solution. So on the piece around why we care, a little bit about ASB. We've been in New Zealand for 177 years. There's close to 1.3 million customers that choose to bank with us. The food and fibre sector is absolutely critical to our history and to our forward strategy. We're really excited about the potential of food and fibre. We think it's It's absolutely central to both New Zealand's economic success, but actually the social fabric that makes up our regional communities is fully underpinned by food and fibre. So when you think about climate, you think about emissions, we look at it from a perspective of the opportunity rather than the obligation. The big part of why we care is our financed emissions, our Scope 3 emissions. You know, agri is roughly 10% of ASB's lending book, but it's 86% of our financed emissions. That's quite a large number, and it forces you to think quite differently about how you approach it. And it's not to say that number needs to go to zero, it's about relative performance to glide paths, but it is still a big, hairy number. The other piece around why we care, this isn't something that's driven by government. It's not something that's driven by, you know, to quote a few of the media pundits, a woke agenda. It's driven by market access, as you've heard in sessions earlier today, and ultimately at its core in banking, we manage and mitigate risk. And there is material risk if we can't meet what the countries we export to are asking of us from our goods. From our perspective, it doesn't actually matter if you believe in climate change or not. What actually matters is, are the people, A, going to pay for our goods, so the border's going to be open or shut, and secondly, what price we're going to get. That's got a huge bearing on then the risk of a farming business when you're sitting in a banker's seat, because if you can't get your goods away, you can afford to service less debt, therefore more risk. The second part of it is on climate change and the warming scenarios. What does that look like for the future use of that land, the viability of that land, and how that generational wealth can pass between families whilst continuing to grow food and fibre? We're in a privileged position with what we see, so we get to see all of the financials, not just the financials that get reported, but all of the financials of our farmers, as well as the environmental metrics that come through. On top of that, we also get the perspective of modelling across, you know, different warming scenarios. So we're doing a lot of climate modelling on what different warming scenarios look like, down to a sort of a 2 square kilometre area that shows us different farmers what the impact of, you know, heat stress or drought, inland or coastal flooding might look like, and then what mitigants different catchment groups might need to think about to stay competitive. We also see some great insights, and there's a couple of stats I thought I might just throw out there just to try and bust a few myths, and probably links into a comment I'll make a bit later on around messaging. But if you look at solar or electrification on farm, we've recently done a survey with Rewiring Aotearoa that looked on farm, what's the appetite for on-farm electrification. So not wholesale solar, but, you know, self-sufficient or energy resilience plus some batteries that help you sell back to the grid. There's 66% latent demand for solar on farm. That's higher than the same survey we did of households in New Zealand of latent demand. So we've got more farmers who are really interested in electrifying their farms than we've got houses in town that are interested in electrifying their houses. The second part of it goes to the alignment between financial and environmental outcomes. And I think there's no decision on farm that can be made in isolation. And we certainly see a strong correlation on farm performance. Take dairy, emissions intensity, the correlation between emissions intensity per kilo of milk solids and cost structure or EBIT per kilo of milk solids is so well correlated, it's not funny. If you're a good farmer financially, you tend to be a very good farmer environmentally. Conversely, those that, you know, run our higher cost structure systems, don't use their grass so efficiently, don't look at their animal genetics as well as they could, tend to have some pretty rough emissions numbers. But within all of that, there is a challenge we see around the messaging that we're taking to market and to our customers. If you stood in a room of dairy farmers and said, please lower your emissions, you know, please reduce the gas that you can't see, that would be somewhat challenging message to deliver. If you stood in front of the same room of farmers and said, can you please optimise your 6-week and calf rate? Can you please eat your grass before you bring supplementary feed down the driveway and can put the right amount of fertiliser on in the right place at the right time? They'll look at each other and say, that makes good sense. They're the same answer, but different ways of thinking about it. No different to solar. If you said, hey, do you want to put solar panels on your farm? The average farmer says no. You talk about how do you think about energy resilience? How do you think about actually maybe cost saving in terms of spiking power prices? The average farmer says that sounds like a great idea. So I think there's a huge message shift we need to have as an industry and start to talk about efficiency, far more productivity, rather than the output, which might be the emissions number or the mitigation to a warming scenario. Finally, I'll just touch on how we're thinking about helping our customers. And first and foremost, we think that this needs to be an industry solution. So we're actively trying to do all we can to not do anything ourselves and partner with industry as much as possible. So that's why we're proudly in Agri Zero. That's why we are partnering with Pāmu on their sustainable progress initiatives. We're putting $1 million over the next 3 years to actually try some things out on a farmer that can probably afford to try things out. And also why, when we think about the role of some of our sustainable loans, why we're trying to find ways to partner with our customers there. We have sustainable linked loans at a corporate business level, and what's been really interesting with those, that's a holistic holistic set of sustainability metrics. Most of our farming customers that have gone on those have found out that they've actually had improved financial performance on the back of it. So that's been the light bulb. One person in the Waikato, I won't name him, I can't see him here, so I think I'm safe, said to me the first day I talked to him about a sustainable linked loan, he wanted to whack me across the chops, and 2 months later he wished he'd done it in his business 12 years ago. So, you know, that mindset shift around the efficiency that you can get from thinking about your business in a sustainable way is quite huge. We also offer all the way down through to project finance, but the challenging part on projects, most of the changes on farm are operational in nature. So it's not a capitally intensive program. When you're thinking about agri, it's ingrained with how you farm rather than it just being a new thing you need to buy. Sorry if there's anyone out here trying to sell new things to farmers when I said that. The other part of it's on guidance and advice. So what's our role? And I've got a few of my sustainability team sitting in the room here, you know, a group of people that can actually have conversations around a kitchen table to talk what does sustainability mean. But then also more importantly on the guidance and advice, what does that look like when you lean into areas such as thought leadership? So we've commissioned a study on how does New Zealand start to optimise its land? So there's plenty of work being done on what is the future use of land. There's actually very little been done on how do we get there. What is that first step? If you're a farmer sitting in Temuka or sitting in Kaikoui, what's that first step that you need to take to get on that journey, and what's the role of capital in there? The final piece is probably on offshore equity, and this is the part that I'll leave you with just to give, a sense of relativity around where New Zealand's positioned versus our global peers. Our first customers that wanted sustainable linked loans were those that had offshore equity in behind them. Our first customers that are asking us about how they can be on the list for AgriZero's first wave of solutions that get delivered in are those with offshore equity in behind them. The customers that are talking to us about, what does it mean to actually think more broadly about biodiversity schemes in New Zealand are those with offshore equity in behind them. So we're seeing family offices globally spending far more time thinking about how do you future-proof. We're also seeing a lot of offshore appetite for food and fibre, which is really exciting. People with a great long-term view of New Zealand food and fibre, but they're wanting us to maintain that competitive advantage, to continue to adapt and innovate as generations of our forefathers have on farm. And I think that's the mindset we need to have, that if our offshore funders ultimately are backing us to continue to innovate and adapt, continue to do what we are great at, that's got to be a great news story. They seem to be at the front of the curve, and we need to make sure we're keeping up. So with that, I'll leave you. Look forward to any curly questions you can flick through on the app shortly, and I'll hand over to either one of the doctors or the monster JJ.
Dr. Carly Green, and there are many questions already, Aidan, so I'm looking forward to the question session.
Well, thanks, kia ora everyone, and such a great pleasure to be here this afternoon. I'm going to bit of disclosure. I'm not in finance, so I feel a little bit of a fish out of water here. So I'm an engineer by my training, and my name is Carly Green, as you now know. I'm the Chief Technical Officer at Environmental Accounting Services. We're a professional services company which is dedicated to the last 20 years to mitigation in the ag and forestry sector. I've been working particularly in measurement, reporting and verification of both regulatory and voluntary disclosures around climate mitigation. And my particular passion basically is in the development of those standards to enable what we've been talking about today, those disclosures to be reported consistently through the supply chains, and then also hopefully through voluntary action also provide mechanisms for finance down to those that are making the change. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about what the role of voluntary action is in financing greenhouse gas mitigation in the ag sector. As I said, I've been working in this space for about 20 years, and at times I feel like I'm doing hill repeats up and down, trying to make traction, and I don't know, I feel like it's really all that work has got me fit for the sprint. I feel like we're now in. I mean, the room is full of the amazing people I've spoke to this morning. We really are seeing quite a huge momentum in this ag space in climate mitigation, and so I definitely feel like I'm fit from all those ups and downs over the last 20 years. So really that pace of change has been quite staggering, and now we're in a situation where we're talking about not just carbon offsets in forestry, but also insetting in the market. And we've talked quite a lot today about the different roles of the different components of the market drivers. So we're definitely not going to be able to just rely on one of these. And so I think there's a combination of regulatory, supply chain responses and investor focus to try and get us to those 2-degree world that they're all aiming for. So what we've seen over the last, particularly the last 3 to 5 years, is this voluntary action is really growing and evolving. You would have heard, many of you probably for the first time today, this term insetting. You will all be quite familiar with offsetting, no doubt. These two mechanisms are basically in the market voluntary action, regardless of whether it's an inset or an offset. But fundamentally, they are both backed by what is now quite mature standards in the marketplace. So it's quite a much more confident space to both work and also for those that are looking to make those voluntary actions to take that action with confidence. What both of these initiatives do is they try to overcome those financial barriers by rewarding early movers in the market, but also to mobilise what we really need, which is long-term systems change. What we know has been pretty much quite historic, well, not historic, but basically offsetting has been around for quite some time. The standards are quite solidified and the programs internationally proving to be both successful, but also, of course, there is also some risk around the projects as well. These types of standards and programs, they generate what is a commodity. You can trade this unit, you generate it and you sell it to somebody else to make a claim against. These commodities have these transactions need to be backed by what has now emerged as these integrity principles to make sure that those offsets are real and permanent. This insetting concept we've been talking today is not about generating a tradable commodity. It's about investing within supply chains to lower the overall emissions of that supply chain. And so you're not actually generating a tradable unit of tonnes, you're overall reducing the whole of supply chains emissions. And more we heard today around retailers and manufacturers looking to their Scope 3 targets. So all of these groups are trying to firstly understand their greenhouse gas emissions in their Scope 3 and then identify those opportunities where they can make investments into the supply chain to reduce as much as possible and to meet their Scope 3 targets. So some of the examples from McDonald's and Woolworths this morning were looking at particular types of examples of how they can mobilise change and what impact that might have to see if they can roll out similar programs across the whole supply chain. So it's about proof of concept at the moment around how to encourage the uptake of technology to lower the overall supply chain targets. I've been doing lots of this, and I was talking to Kelly before. She told me that this will make you all understand what insetting and offsetting are, so hopefully that has been successful. I want to just mention that there's basically in the actions we're actually talking about, both in offsetting and insetting, it goes beyond trees as an option for mitigation. And these are just some of the global methodologies available to both generate offsets within the voluntary carbon market, but also these types of activities would be considered appropriate for insetting within the supply chain as well. Thankfully, particularly over the last 5 years, and specifically since the integrity principles have been set by the ICVCM internationally, we're seeing quite a lot more rigour in the transparency and the quantification within the standards. And this is really being driven because those that are investing, those that are making these claims and setting these targets need to make sure that those claims are being credibly reported, and so they can reduce the risk of investment in those activities. So I guess really both voluntary carbon markets as well as insetting opportunities within the supply chain are active already within agricultural supply chains, both here in New Zealand, but particularly in North and South America and also in Australia, where there's lots of conversations around how both of these can work in parallel. Although, of course, there's some specific rules also around how to make sure that there's no double counting or double claiming and all these other terms within those systems as well. It gives producers options, is what I would say, in terms of both and overlaid with regulatory support as well. These could provide a range of different opportunities for producers to make those reductions and magnify the change we need to make. So I think what, for me, we are sprinting towards 2025, which is only 5 years away from those targets we saw earlier, and those interim targets are super important for us to hit. So I think if we can increase all of our awareness around all the full range of opportunities, and increase that collaboration, which I really feel like we've been doing today. It's been an amazing day already for me, and I really can't wait for tomorrow, to increase that collaboration between all of us, to find the best solutions for not just the supply chain, not just for to meet our NDCs, but to also support producers to be more productive, low emissions, and make the contribution we know they can make to our climate change targets. And I'll leave you with a picture of my backyard down in Lake Hawea, and look forward to the conversation. Thanks.
Right, Amelia.
Awesome. Tēnā koutou katoa. I'm Amelia Sharman. I'm Director of Sustainability Reporting at the External Reporting Board, otherwise known as XRB. Who is the XRB? We are a small independent Crown entity. We set the rules when you report on your financial reporting, your audit and assurance, and also now your climate reporting. Standards are secondary legislation in New Zealand. Sometimes they come down through international boards, but they all have to become part of the secondary legislation suite in New Zealand. Who knows about Aotearoa New Zealand climate standards? Put your hand up if you've heard of them. Put your hand up if you've read them. Woo! Okay, this should be a quick whistle-stop tour. I'm very happy to answer lots of questions about the standards. So today I'm just going to give you 3 key bits of information. Why report on climate-related risks and opportunities? What are the climate standards that operate here in New Zealand? And thirdly, what are the international trends in climate disclosure, which I know, has been a bit of a theme today. So firstly, why report? So one of the essential functions of financial markets is to price risk, and that's so you can support informed and efficient capital market allocation decisions. And also, so that means that to support that, businesses and others need to provide information to the market to be able to make those informed decisions. And on climate, many businesses will already be facing climate-related risks and opportunities, whereas for others, it might still be a bit more of a future prospect. So why report? In New Zealand, as in many other jurisdictions, which I will discuss further later, there's a legislative requirement now to talk about your climate-related risks and opportunities. However, it's really important to keep in mind that this legislative requirement is about enabling 2 other key outcomes. Firstly, it's about better decision-making by investors, so that they can make more informed decisions about the climate-related risks and opportunities facing the businesses and other entities that they invest into. And then really importantly, it's about better strategy by the businesses themselves. So the idea is that working through these disclosure requirements helps businesses think about their own strategic choices in light of the risks and opportunities that climate change is bringing to them. A key message I always say anytime I get the chance to talk to people is that we think that even if you don't have to report publicly, considering your climate-related risks and opportunities is really valuable, and the standards are there as a way of kind of thinking through some key questions that you might want to know if you're wanting to know further about this, even if you don't have to report. So what are the reporting requirements here in New Zealand, and who do they apply to? The regime covers what are known as climate reporting entities, and those are set in primary legislation by the government, We at the XRB, we don't say who needs to report on anything, we just say what you need to report once the government decides the who. So these are your large listed debt and equity issuers on the left, and then your large financial organisations on the right, like ASB and other large banks, etc. Interestingly, because it's large listed debt, it does include Auckland Council. You know, some of the other public sector bodies are also required to report. In total, it's under 200 entities. So very, very small compared to some of the other disclosure regimes. I'll talk about Australia later. That's over 20,000 coming in Australia. The standards have been effective from 1 January 2023. And so what that means is that the first mandatory climate statements are all available for you to read should you have, some spare time before Christmas. They're available on a company's office register if anyone wishes to read those. So while farmers themselves may not be climate reporting entities, although obviously larger players like Fonterra, etc. are, farmers are in the value chain of these financial institutions through the financing that they provide. And so, the banks, insurers, etc., they need to know about the climate-related risks and opportunities of these things that they provide finance to. And I don't know if you can see, but that is represented in this diagram by that little dollar bill, which represents financed emissions. And so for our financial institutions, that is by far and away, as Aidan said, the biggest source of their emissions. But, importantly, we need to remember that farmers are by no means the only ones captured here. The reporting includes all of the bank's lending portfolio, which includes all sectors of the economy. It includes all of the fund managers' investments, so again, across all sectors of the economy. And that's really important, that breadth of reporting and coverage, is because one of the core aims of this type of disclosure is to reduce across the world overall systemic risk from climate change. So onto the disclosures themselves. In New Zealand, they're in a set of 3 standards called Aotearoa New Zealand Climate Standards. They are based on the recommendations of something called the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. All climate reporting across the world is based on this same 4-pillar structure of strategy, governance, risk management, and metrics and targets. Our standards are very short. They're only about 5 pages, the first standard. They're designed to be very flexible, very principles-based, because we acknowledged, A, there's a wide breadth of entities captured, and B, we were the first to put standards-based to climate reporting, although again, as you'll see, everyone else is catching up very fast. Something else I want to point out is that in New Zealand, we are really clear that these standards have a purpose, and that's in that quote there. They really are designed to support the allocation of capital. And when I say capital, I mean external capital as well as your internal capital allocation decisions to support that transition to a low emissions, climate resilient future. We purposefully brought in resilience into that purpose statement because it's not just about mitigating, it's also about being ready for whatever the future holds. And that was one of the key things about this risk opportunity frame, that it does bring in resilience. And again, I would also say these standards are focused about disclosure. So revealing information about what the entity is or isn't doing for the future. It's not a black and white pass or fail checklist. It's not a set of performance. If an entity has no target, they disclose they have no target. It's not us saying you must have a target and therefore you disclose. So it's really about what are you doing, being transparent about that. These 2 documents were published this year. Firstly, it's just a basic guide about the regime, and then a reader's guide, and that's really about understanding what comes out in climate statements, because particularly for people used to quantitative information and financial reporting, this information is very different to what a traditional investor might understand to be useful for their decision making. So I do highly recommend having a look at those guides. They're co-published with the FMA because this is a regulated scheme in New Zealand, regulated by the Financial Markets Authority. And then finally, international trends. So Diana talked about this stat before from MPI. Over 80% of New Zealand's exports by value are going to countries with mandatory climate-related disclosures, either in force or proposed. And this is from a report from Chapman Tripp, and it's really trying to explain that, you know, even if you're not required to report yourself, you are going to be asked information about climate change, either through a supplier relationship because they are captured, you know, through a CBAM, you know, again, as Diana talked about, or, you know, those customer expectations. And it is not just climate. So whilst climate is mandatory in New Zealand, other areas are coming very, very rapidly. Nature, there's a new task force on inequality and social related financial disclosures. There's work on human capital. There's lots and lots of stuff. We're really interested in New Zealand about this integration of all of these topics rather than getting, you know, vast screeds of separate reporting, but it's definitely something we are very, very busy looking at. And then, as I said at the start, it is not just New Zealand. So in many of our key trading partners, it's already here, or it's coming very soon. And importantly, in some of them, like Europe or California, if you do enough business in that jurisdiction, you are also required to report. So you don't have to even be a business in that jurisdiction. If you do enough trade with Europe or do enough trade with California, you will have to report. We pay really close attention to these rules. We work incredibly actively at an international level to try and influence these international rules. We do a lot of work on international alignment of this work, trying to help for the good of New Zealand. We're hosting the Californians who are coming in March next year, for example, to try and, you know, really explain what we have, the lessons we have learnt. And I know there was a question in the previous session about what about some of New Zealand's other trading partners. Yes, for example, in February 2024, the Reserve Bank of India released a draft standard disclosure framework on climate-related risks. It's coming in Korea. You know, they've just issued some reporting standards in South Korea. So this is definitely a trend that is building and building and building. So please go onto our website, sign up to our newsletter, follow us on LinkedIn. We have a vast amount of resources available on our website, and we're always really happy to answer your questions. Thanks.
And I can attest that you do have lots of webinars and things as well. It keeps people updated, and as you've worked out also that they don't communicate in a way that is painful. It is easy to understand, easy to learn from, and I'm really grateful for how you guys I've learned a lot from XRB, so thank you. Aidan, I'm going to start with you for a question. And I would say all of you probably, when you get back to your desk, pop in and just see what the questions were, because there's been a few nice comments as well. Aidan, we heard more financially safe farmers are performing better environmentally. Is it correlation or causation?
Oh, if I knew the answer to that, I'd probably be a very rich man. I think we've got one of our largest farmers in Southland. He's got a saying that what's good for the planet is good for the pocket, and he's had that mantra for 20 years in his farming business. I think at its core, it's tough to run in any business, a good business year in, year out if you don't look after your people, in the case of farmers, your animals and your land. And you might have the odd good year based on commodity prices or a good punt one way or the other, but at its core, if you don't look after your land, your animals and your people, it makes it pretty hard to run a good farming business. So I think that's at its simplest how I think about it, and why I think we need to have the conversation about farming and climate sort of in an integrated way rather than in isolation.
Yeah, and you sort of wonder too, you know, if you're deep in your financials and you're actually engaged, you're doing your reporting, you know, you're thinking about other forms of potential markets, you're probably able to analyse what your business can digest as far as how you act as well. So if you already know that you've got X margin or X profit, you know that you can invest 5% or 10% of that in something.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, Carly, can you comment on water footprinting, given water scarcity may be an issue internationally with climate change, and how soon it may come to New Zealand?
I probably can't, but only because I don't really work in that space too much beyond sort of side discussions with some of the work going on in FAO at the moment to try and monitor that. Definitely the way I see it is that we've definitely, for a reason, got quite a focus on greenhouse gas mitigation at the moment, but ESG or full ESG reporting and commitments are coming, and of course water, biodiversity, and even as you were mentioning around the social and governance aspects. It's logical that is the next step here, and I think the monitoring, the standards as well as the measurement, reporting and verification frameworks that are built around those will make that transition a little, easier possibly in the future as well. So people shouldn't be too worried.
Yeah, I think we've got to realise it's not a set and forget, and I think with ESG. Unfortunately, it's being turned into we judge you, but like you said before, it's literally around transparency. If you want to invest in weapons, you'd fill your boots. It's not me to judge, but if you're in my KiwiSaver, I want to know. So I think unfortunately ESG sort of got captured by the marketing department at some point, and we've really got to get it back to it's a business thing. I always get it's a socialist construct, and I always giggle because it's not. It's wealthy people wanting to stay wealthy because they're trying to protect wealth as well. Now, Amelia, this is an interesting one. When more than one entity is reporting on Scope 3 emissions from the same farms, does anyone check that the reported emissions are the same?
Good question. So, you're an engineer. I'm actually a geographer. I'm not an accountant. And so when I tried to explain to the accountants that double counting was okay, it was very stressful. And then also explaining that it's not just double counted, it could actually be 50 counted. In New Zealand, if you are reporting as a climate reporting entity your greenhouse gas emissions, you do need to get them assured. So that is the only part of the climate reporting in New Zealand that needs to be subject to mandatory independent assurance. In Australia, for example, the climate regime that's coming in, every single part of the climate reporting will be subject to mandatory assurance. So good luck to them. I don't know how you assure scenario analysis, for example. But that they should absolutely be the same. But it depends, again, on what measurement standard you're using. So you could use the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, you could use the ISO standard, you could make some quite important, fundamental choices right down at the bottom of your measurement journey that means that the reported emissions as a single number look different. In the climate reporting standards, we require you to disclose which measurement standard you use. We require you to disclose your methods and estimation, data uncertainty, etc. So the idea really is that there should be transparency because, yes, the numbers might look different. And importantly, again, if you are a climate reporting entity, but even if you're not, you're doing this because it's a supplier, you need to provide information up to your suppliers. We encourage really good record keeping. So again, you don't have to disclose your greenhouse gas emissions inventory in New Zealand. We decided that would be, a bit too far for disclosure at this stage. But keep one and have it available if people want to check it out.
My plea on this topic, while I've got a room full of people that hopefully can help affect change, is for all of us at Scope 3 emissions, there's one farmer at the end of it. And the more that you need to have different reporting going in different directions to different bodies of the farmer, you're taking away from the productive capacity or capability of that farming business. So I think as an industry, we need to do all we can to champion any work to make it easier for the farmer to report this, because it's only going to get more in terms of the amount of reporting, different people who need to understand it. We've already got a productivity challenge in the country, and it doesn't make sense to add to that.
I will also jump in there and say that there is quite a lot of work internationally, and we're also thinking about it quite a lot at the XRB about reporting for small and medium enterprises, not mandatory, but again to try and make it consistent so that it is easier to kind of report up and down that value chain.
I was just going to add as well that I think if we think about those entities, regardless of their size, that they're reporting, and then the thing they're reporting to, the program they're reporting to, they'll have their own accounting rules. And so the information that they report, how they get accounted, is up to the actual end reporting agency. So it should be relatively simple for the farmer or the producer at the producer level to then report up, and then that accounting gets done when say McDonald's or Woolworths report their SBT target progress.
Yeah, should is the operative word there. But yes, absolutely it should be. Now, look, I have got another one here that's quite... Where is it? It is for you, Aidan. our sustainability as a country is ranked very high. What stops us? Well, I'm not sure. It kind of is. I think we need to be careful with that one. What stops us being able to access all rural lending as sustainable loans? I feel like I could answer this one, to be fair, but you go.
So the thing you're going to see more and more of is probably less of a price lever on sustainable loans and more of an access to capital. And what I mean by that is 3 or 4 years ago, green bonds, for example, in market were quite prevalent. There's actually a price differential for green versus non-green bonds, and that influences then how you on lend. More and more, and it's evolving very rapidly, it's just the part of doing business. It's now what is expected. So we probably see, from a banking perspective, the sustainable lending to be more about the non-financial benefits of that product, and that might be, you know, some slightly more flexible terms, some different sets of advice you can get, some partnerships you can access, far more than the cost of that debt, because globally that value isn't being prescribed. So, you know, yes, there's an argument you could have a full farm sustainable loan product. There's quite a cost of compliance. The hard piece for that from our perspective, and we've got a couple of competitors that have played in the sandpit, we don't think the role of the bank is one of compliance. We actually think it's about adaptation, mitigation, and the opportunity to grow. And you risk putting too much cost into the business to comply with that loan product versus the benefit that may exist.
There's sort of it's not a follow-on question, but it follows on from that. Do you see a time that you'd start charging a premium for those who just aren't kind of, I don't know how to word this, you know,
I'm not on Sandy's good list.
People taking the piss, basically. The laggards.
Look, I mean, I'm more than happy for a few of our competitors to have a few of those in their bucket. But no, look, I think because there's such a link between the underlying finance, like it's pretty hard to be a really good environmental business and a pretty shitty financial business, or vice versa. So I think inherently it's actually probably already happening, because those that tend to have poorer earnings potential tend to be less efficient running their farming businesses. They don't quite have the genetics they could have in their herd. They don't optimise their grass as much as they could. They don't put the right amount of fert on, or they waste fert, waste grass, whatever it might be. So I think you'll see it, you know, the conversation needs to come back to that integrated farming business, because I don't see a world that you'll be judged in isolation for your emissions. I actually think that's going to become, I'd love it to become the KPI on farm efficiency rather than something you're judged on in isolation.
Awesome. Now, Carly, here's a crunchy one for you. That you've got all the crunchy ones, haven't you?
Thanks.
Yeah. If a supermarket funds insetting activity on farms within its supply chain, can a CPG company or processor claim the same reductions in its scope 3 emissions?
So when we're talking about, I mean, I guess this comes to the double counting conversation we were just having, that is not really. So basically where I'm going to is that it's around the whole supply chain, lowering the emissions across the whole supply chain. So because we report scope 1, 2 and 3, then at the farm, their scope 1 is the manufacturer's scope 3, and so they just get reported through the supply chain, lowering the whole supply chain. So everyone benefits from lower emissions across each entity. So it's not double counting per se, it's about lowering the whole supply chain's emissions. Yeah.
And I guess that's the key, right? Like, this is about behaviour change, not how to be really good at reporting.
That's right. And that's why the conversation we've always had is around scope 3 is around this double counting issue, and it's not really about that. It's about how you have an informed, appropriate and effective conversation with your partners. And it helps you to identify those partners where the opportunities are to make those reductions within the targets that everyone has set. And so it's a communication channel. It's not about reporting the emissions, in my opinion.
Amelia, have you got any thoughts on that?
It is. I can't say this because I work for the External Reporting Board, but it's way more important than reporting.
Yeah.
This is about decision making. This is definitely about decision making. We are really, really lucky in the primary legislation in New Zealand that there is a specified purpose for climate reporting that is about entity level decision making. Not many other places have that, and that's fantastic, because what it means is that we, as the standard setter, can put stuff in the climate, standards that actually are about helping you, the reporting entities, make better decisions, and then communicating those, onto your user. So absolutely, you can't report if you're not doing something, and our job is really to help provide guidance, etc., about how you do, some of this stuff.
I remember in, I think it was 2022, I went up and talked to BlackRock, and, part of their thing was, probably not a good thing to say today, actually, but not as good as it used to be. But anyway, for them it was more around they don't want 137 pages of scenery. What they need is basically a spreadsheet with numbers on it. And I think, if you read most and they have got better, but many sustainability reports in New Zealand just really benefit a graphic designer, not any actual. And I think that's the key, right? Like, if you don't have something to report on, don't report on it. Don't make a story up about it. If you have to create a story, it means that you haven't done the thing, because you should just have to report a number or a metric.
Yeah, absolutely. Something we are seeing internationally in trends in sustainability reporting is actually fewer material risks and opportunities are being identified. Like, when people start off on their reporting journey, they tend to have, even up to like 20, and then you have a page per risk per, it's a lot. It's way too much, like, what are actually the most important things that you are, needing to communicate about, and then really hone in on that. But that, that is a sophistication thing that does tend to come with time.
And, I was always taught, just give it a go, to start. It's pretty simple. Now, I'm going to ask this question to everyone. Targets for reducing in both absolute reductions and emissions intensity have both been discussed today. There are mixed messages. Can we have clarity on what the government versus market want?
There's an MP in the room that could probably help us with what the government does want. I think it comes back to what behaviour you're trying to drive. And when we think about it, so at an ASB level, we want to reduce our gross emissions. However, we want to incentivise the right behaviour change on farm. And we think the right behaviour change on farm, especially if you want New Zealand Food and Fibre to continue to contribute the way it does, is around emissions intensity. And I think we're going to start to see, more conversations going one way or the other, depending on the industry you're talking about. In my view, from a rural or food and fibre perspective, if we step away from intensity being the conversation we're having, we risk stepping away from us being a productive outputter of food and fibre and our relative competitiveness, and instead we just take pride in a few less cows or a few less sheep, which doesn't actually solve a challenge for the world.
As the XRB, we do not care. The point is to disclose. If you have a target, whatever that target is, you disclose it. If you have no target, you may decide to disclose that.
I guess from my point of view, that the standards, SBT standards, have both emissions intensity and absolute targets. As a 20-year veteran here, I would say it's super important we have absolute targets if we're going to hit 2 degrees. So that would be my point.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. You guys have been awesome, and there are a lot of questions here, so do have a wee read through. And I don't know if you can follow up with Q&As or something, but thank you so much, and thanks for the questions. And I'm going to get out of the way and hand to Harry. Where's Harry? There he is, and he's going to take it forward.